All right, so there are various ways of classifying raptors or birds of prey or hawks, whatever you want to call them. But it does matter what you call them, kind of. The other thing I'd like to say before we go any further is that to thank you, Diane, for that very nice introduction. I do indeed enjoy birding with people, even though at the moment, because of COVID, I tend to go out on my own rather. Sometimes if you go out on your own, you actually end up seeing more birds because I tend to be a bit chatty and I like to chat to people when I'm with them. There are various ways of, the other thing I was going to say was, please don't expect absolute expertise here. There are people that I've seen online as I was browsing through the pictures of people and the names who know a lot more about identification of raptors than I do, but hopefully I'm going to aim this talk kind of at beginners or people who aren't all that comfortable with identifying raptors, and those of you who've handled them in the hand or who are known experts and so on, please bear with me. You all know who you are. So there are various different ways of classifying the birds that I'm going to talk about. One way is to look at the actual sort of biological classification. We can talk about the birds that are considered to be in the group known as diurnal raptors, that is to say, birds of prey other than the nocturnal ones, such as owls. So vultures, which went through a phase of people thinking that they were not raptors at all, but more related to storks. Well, that's all been changed around, just like a lot of things in bird taxonomy have been changed around, and vultures are now considered to be a form of raptor. Eagles, which are the ones that we have here and not necessarily closely biologically related, but I'll come back to that. Harriers, osprey, which is basically a unique member of one family. Accipiters, which I'm certainly going to come back to in terms of identification. Buteos, which are the sort of, they call them buzzards in the UK, but they're the obvious example of that is the red-tailed hawk. Eagles, we talked about, and then falcons, which again, DNA and genetic analysis has, in the last few years, shown that they are very unrelated to other forms of raptors. In fact, it's thought that their genetic nearest family are parrots of all things. So maybe we should be talking about peregrine parrots in the future. So anyway. All right, now we can classify them differently for identification purposes, and that's what I've done here. We can talk about raptors that are either soaring or flying, those that are perched. We can talk a bit about field marks, and we can talk about general impression, or jizz, so-called. If any of you are Scrabble players, I guess there's only one Z, but you could use a blank or something. That would be a great score if you could get jizz on a triple letter score or a triple word score. That word apparently comes from aerial gunners during World War II who used the term GISS, or General Impression Size and Shape, to identify enemy aircraft so they didn't shoot down their own home aircraft. And that became jizz, which is used by birders. So what about points regarding bird identification with particular sort of use for raptors? The first thing is, if you've got a field guide with you or an app, and a lot of people these days have the app equivalent to the field guide, study the bird before you look at the book. You really are not going to get very far if you take one quick look at the bird, decide what it might be, and then spend the next 10 minutes looking at the book. By then, the bird's either gone or it's turned around or something like that. So look at the bird first and try and look at the whole bird. There are some raptors where you really need to look at the whole bird because that particular species did not have one particular diagnostic field mark necessarily. And start with the head, because as in most birds, it's the head or the face, the eyes that give you more information than the rest. Look at the shape, general impression, and the flight style. So for instance, give you an example. If you've got, if you're in a deep mixed forest in the middle of July and a raptor comes zooming straight at your head through the trees with talons outstretched and you don't have a helmet on, you know that it's probably not an osprey. Okay, so flight style is very important. Colors are not so important for raptors, but they can be in some cases. Raptors are not like warblers, where, warblers, it's the colors that really matter. Flight style is not so important because they basically all do more or less the same thing. But raptors, flight style, and general impression is very important in terms of identification. Now, photos can be either helpful or confusing. I'm a great believer in field guides that don't have photos, but field guides that have drawings or paintings. And I think the best field guides, if I'm allowed to say this, are Sibley and National Geographic. There are many other field guides. There's also the Merlin app, which a lot of people like, but again, it can point you in the wrong direction sometimes. And I'll show you some examples as we go along as to when photos can be helpful and when they can be confusing. In particular, they can be confusing when there's one photo or a photo that's rather fuzzy, or that's what my wife likes to say. If I show her a picture and say, do you like this? She says, well, it's fuzzy, so I always junk that. Remember that common birds are common, and it's important to learn when and where a particular bird occurs. And as I've mentioned, if you want to see a goshawk, you don't go to the coast, except migration hotspots. If you want to see an osprey, you don't go into the middle of the woods, and so on and so forth. Also, if you want to see an osprey, don't bother in the winter because they're not here. You have to go to Florida. Beware of high expectations. It's very easy particularly if you're a bird lister and you're looking for, say, a lifer. Somebody's told you that there is, let's say, for example, a Townsend solitaire in Halifax somewhere. You go to the appointed spot and you have a quick glimpse of something that's the right shape for a Townsend solitaire, and you say, hey, God, that must be it. But everybody else said, well, did you see the mockingbird that was there as well? And so that's an example of beware of high expectations, but also think of the unexpected. It works the other way around. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along as well. Is everybody kind of hearing me, and am I making sense so far? Can you hear me and see me? Yeah?
Good here in Lunenburg County.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we can hear you here.
Okay.
Hear you in Wolfville.
And are you seeing the slides?
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay.
Absolutely.
So thank you. So here are some problems with identifying almost any bird, but raptors in particular, and one or two other groups of birds. A number of raptors have variable plumage and also so-called polymorphism. What that means is that the same species can have different colors or shapes or shades. An example of variable plumage would be a bird that looks different in its juvenile or first year plumage compared to when it's an adult. And the obvious common example that we see around here all the time are bald eagles, which look quite different when they're young from when they're 4 or 5 years old. Polymorphism is a little bit different. What that means is that a particular species can occur in different color morphs. A good example of that would be rough-legged hawks, for example, where immatures and adults can be either a sort of light morph where they're mostly pale, or a dark morph where they're mostly very dark or black. And that's nothing to do with how old the bird is, it's more to do with what particular color morph you're actually seeing. So that can be a bit confusing. Changes in shape due to lighting and wind, and in particular with raptors that tend to fly in the open, wind makes a huge difference. You'll see in the field guides that there are certain flight styles that can identify raptors, but if it's very windy, all that goes basically out the window. And the effect of lighting on plumage is another one. In raptors, but the particular example that I'll just give you is in a different group of birds. If you're driving by a field on a sunny day and there are 1,000 herring gulls in that field, the mantle, which is the back or the wings or both, of every single one will look a different color, a different shade of gray, because of the way the sun is shining on the feathers. So that's a big issue in terms of using color or not using color to identify a bird, and raptors, that's the case there as well. Habitat and habits we've talked about, and age and sex. Well, age, age can be important. Sex generally, I mean, the sex of the bird, is not so important, except that in virtually all raptors, females are larger than males. I think there are some biological reasons for that, which are somewhat speculative, but nevertheless, if you, and a good example of that, for instance, is that a male Cooper's hawk is about the same size as a female sharp-shinned hawk. There is actually about a 1 centimeter difference, but if you're on a windy day and you're looking at the bird whizzing around in the wind and dipping behind trees and you sort of see it for a minute, the size isn't going to matter very much to you. All right. So let's look at raptor ID when they're soaring or flying. So basically there are two groups. If you've got big, black, wide, non-pointed wings and a slow flap, vultures and eagles. If they're any size, dark or light, soaring and a slow flap, but they're not a vulture or an eagle, then it's a buteo probably, although other raptors do soar and sort of fly as well. If the wings are held like an inverted U, kind of, can you see me doing that? Yeah, like a great black back gull, sometimes it's an osprey. If the wings are held in a dihedral, what that means is that they're a shallow V. Can you see me doing that? Kind of a shallow V. Basically, two raptors in Nova Scotia that do that all the time is turkey vultures and northern harriers. If the bird is small and it flaps rapidly and then does a quick glide for a few seconds, it's probably an accipiter. But all raptors do flaps and glides. Red-tailed hawks do it. They flap for a few seconds and then they glide for a few seconds. But it's the accipiters, which we'll come to a bit later on, which do it very quickly. And they're small. They kind of flap, 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 and then glide, flap, 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 very fast. And if it's got pointed wings and a very fast flight, it's probably a falcon. So those are the birds we're going to talk about. Now, what about raptors that are perched? They're often harder to identify than when they're flying. Because when they're perched, some of the field marks are hidden, or they look roughly the same shape, or other things like that. So if you see, unlike other birds or other large birds, which are easier to identify when they're perched, raptors tend to be easier to identify when they're flying. Some are obvious, like adult bald eagles, red tails, and some falcons. And you need to use a combination of field marks. Most raptors, there is no one field mark that always distinguishes it from something similar. And that's going back to one of the earlier slides when I said, look at the whole bird and basically start with the head or face first. Some are really hard, and we'll come back to the two famous ones, if you like, or the two most talked about, which are adult sharpshins and Cooper's hawks. Now, what about birds that are not raptors but look like them? And this can be very confusing sometimes. Rock pigeons and mourning doves fly fast. And I'll show you a picture of what I think can be confusing. They can look like all kinds of other birds if you don't really look properly, but they can look like fast-flying raptors sometimes. Ravens that are either soaring or perched, particularly if you don't actually see the bill. For example, if it's got its back to you or it's got its head tucked in, can look like a big dark raptor. Great black-backed gulls can sometimes be confused with ospreys. I put cuckoos in because of one incident actually it was 3 weeks ago. We were having a picnic at a picnic table outdoors in northern Cape Breton, not far from Meat Cove. And I saw this bird whizzed by, immediately looked up and yelled, "Merlin!" Got my binoculars on it, and it was actually a yellow-billed cuckoo, which in flight had the same shape as a merlin. So that was just a kind of one-off thing. You're far more likely to see a merlin than a yellow-billed cuckoo in Nova Scotia, but beware anyway. And the other one is swallows. A close-up swallow flying fast can look like a distant falcon flying fast. And again, I'll show you an example of that. So just beware of those kind of, it sounds silly, but just beware of them. What kind of gear do you need to watch raptors? And I'm not going to go into all this in detail. Every single one of these is the subject of a talk on its own. But I find that 10 power binoculars are probably the best. When a raptor is rather distant, 8 power binoculars are often not quite enough. A scope is useful for identifying distant raptors that are perched, but don't forget, most raptors' eyesight is probably 10 times better than most people's. And if you get a scope out and start pointing this great big thing that looks like an eye at it, even if it's a long way away, the chances are it'll see you and head off into the wild blue yonder. So some people are very good at finding soaring raptors with their scope, pointing at the sky and moving them around. I've never been able to do that myself. So anyway, all right. Let's talk about big raptors that soar, glide, and perch in the open. I think everybody knows what this is, an adult bald eagle. They are very common all over Nova Scotia and have been increasing. Certainly in the valley, they've been increasing. In Kings County alone, we know of probably a dozen or more nests these days. Of course, you can come and see bald eagles to your heart's content by coming to one of the Eagle Watch weekends in Sheffield Mills, the last weekend in January or the first weekend in February, usually. I don't know if that's going to take place this year because of COVID, or this winter rather. You can drive around the lanes at Grand Pré. I was there this morning on a rather fruitless quest for shorebirds and saw probably about 30 bald eagles as I was driving around. Here's another picture of what you can see by going to Sheffield Mills in the winter. They come in close. Equally interesting for me is the crowd of usually 100 or more people with probably 10 grand's worth of photographic equipment. And I'm always interested in seeing what other people can get with stuff that I can't afford. That's great. The other nice thing about the Sheffield Mills weekends, if they're going to do it this winter, as I say, which they may well not, is that they do really good sausage and pancake breakfasts with blueberry sauce on the pancakes. So that's always nice. Now, this is a picture of a pair of bald eagle chicks in the nest. And the thing that's different about them, of course, in terms of identification or field marks, is that there's no white on the head. And the birds are nearly all just black. There's a few pale feathers, but they're basically black. So how does a bald eagle get from being black like this to having a white head and a white tail? And the answer is it takes at least 4, generally about 5 years for it to do so. And during those 4 or 5 years, they have a bewildering variety of sort of dark and light patches. There's no easy way of determining how much black and how much white will age a bald eagle. One that's mostly black can be 1 year old, or one that's got a bit of white on it can be 2 years old, and so on and so forth. But, and this becomes important later on, just look at the general shape, as we talked about before, and flight style. They flap and glide just like all raptors, but they do it very slowly. They're big. They're not the biggest of all birds that we see around here. Great blue herons are probably bigger. Turkey vultures are at least the same size. Sandhill cranes, if you ever get lucky enough to see one, are probably the same size or bigger. But if you can see this patch of white in the armpit or the wing pit, the axilla, it's nearly always there after sort of the first, once the bird is properly able to fly and it's gone through its first molt. and this can be important. There's lots of white patches elsewhere. This one's got a more or less white tail, so probably 2 or 3 years old. It's beginning to get a white head. But they always have that patch of white in the armpit, and they always have the great big yellow bill. Here's another one, kind of heading towards me. Again, that patch of white in the armpit. So here's a picture of a bald eagle, a young bald eagle, again, with a patch of white in the armpit, being chased by two. Everybody know whether these are crows or ravens, by the way? They're ravens, okay? Everybody got that? They have this very wedge-shaped tail, and quite apart from anything else, apart from the croaking noise and so forth, or all the other noises that they can make, that will identify a raven for you as against a crow. But this is a useful kind of picture because it shows you the size as compared to a raven. The other big, mostly black bird that we see more and more in certain parts of Nova Scotia anyway is the turkey vulture. And these seem to be becoming more common where they've always occurred, and their range is also spreading. You can see flocks of 100 or more, if you're lucky, in places where they are common, such as Briar Island and Yarmouth County. They fly a little bit differently from eagles. They do flap, but they flap very slowly, and they hold their wings in that dihedral. Dihedral is a sort of aviation term for a shallow V, and they kind of rock backwards and forwards. So I don't know whether you can see me, but I'm going to hold my hands like this and sort of rock like that, and then do a big slow flap, and then go like that again. I don't know whether you could all see that, but that's how turkey vultures fly. And here's one in the middle of a flap. Now, they're not all black. The flight feathers on the wings are a silvery white. That doesn't always show up, but it does in certain lights. And that, again, goes back to what I originally said about the lighting is very important. The head is red in adult birds. It's a dark purplish color in young birds. And here is, this was just a small part of the scene at the Western Light on Briar Island a couple of weeks ago when I was there. There were about 60 turkey vultures, but again, the sun was shining, and this shows the contrast between these white flight feathers and the black coverts, so-called. It's a bit of a mystery where they go and where they come from. Like a lot of these raptors that flock. You go to Briar Island, you see flocks of, I don't know, 25, 50, 100 of these. They never, or they do land, they rarely land. They land under specific circumstances, which I'll come to in a minute. But most of them just drift over the island, and a lot of the flocks of birds seem to follow the coastline and kind of drift off. And I think I'm right in saying that only one actual turkey vulture's nest has ever been found in Nova Scotia, and that was in Halifax County. I may be wrong, and if so, please feel free to correct me afterwards. This is what one looks like on the ground. There was a dead seal on the beach on Briar Island. It's been there for at least a month, and there were lots of turkey vultures on the ground that were obviously very interested in it. They're an interesting bird the way they hunt. They soar and they fly around, and they have an incredibly good sense of smell, apparently. And if they can smell something dead or rotting, they will go down and investigate it. And other turkey vultures that may be invisible to the naked eye because they're so far away can spot this and follow them down. I tried this once when there was a flock of turkey vultures flying around over our cabin on Briar Island, and I dumped about 3 days worth of smelly old garbage on the lane in front of the cabin, hoping one would come down. Never worked, so I ended up having to clear it all up again, which I did. All right. The other bird that flies in a similar way, or one of the other birds to turkey vultures, are northern harriers. This is also a bird that it doesn't flap as much as a turkey vulture, but it also holds its wings in a shallow V and kind of rocks backwards and forwards like that. Harriers can be sometimes quite difficult to identify because they can make their wings look pointed when they want to. And they have long, narrow wings. And when they're flying high, particularly on migration, they can look like falcons, for example. Harriers are one of the few birds of prey where it's easy, well, relatively easy to tell birds that are less than 1 year old, juveniles, from adult females and from adult males. And a lot of the ones that we see at this time of the year are the juveniles, where they're basically all brown, and in particular the undersides are much darker than this. They're a kind of rich, rusty color. This bird is probably an adult female because the underparts are relatively pale with streaking. That's not a hard and fast rule amongst harriers or any other bird of prey. And one of the things that can be confusing is eye color. Most birds of prey, the juveniles, have a yellow eye color. Some of them they don't. And some of them the eye color doesn't change, and some of them it does. So that's another example of where you need to look at, if you want to actually age or sex one of these birds, you need to look at all the field marks, not just the undersides kind of thing. Here's another bird, which this one actually still has some streaking, but it's got a more rich, sort of darker color on the underside. This is also a harrier, and I felt this was probably an immature, but somebody who I showed the photograph to thought it was an adult female. So there we go. This is a male northern harrier, an adult male. Now again, like all birds of prey, harriers can take 2 or 3 years to get their full adult plumage. And so this bird is probably at least 3 years old. Some people I've noticed online in the last couple of years talk about the grey ghost being another name for this, the male northern harrier. I'm not sure why that should apply to this particular bird. A lot of birds are grey, and I suppose the way it hovers over, or doesn't hover, the way it hunts over fields might look ghostly to some people. It's a nice name anyway. But this is an adult male. All northern harriers have this white patch at the base of the tail. And that's another way to identify them. So let's talk a bit now about the buteos, of which by far the most common in Nova Scotia, or the most widespread, may not be the most numerical, but it's the most widespread, is this one. And this is one of the ones where, at least if you see a particular field mark, you've got the identification right off, because it's the only bird of prey that has a red tail. So it's a red-tailed hawk. Okay, it's not actually red, of course, it's sort of rusty colored. Now, young red-tailed hawks in the first year of life don't have a red tail. So that can be confusing, but at least where we are in Nova Scotia, pretty much all red-tailed hawks have this black or dark patch of feathers there, and this dark leading edge to the inner wing. And I'll show you some pictures of young ones. If you go out west, if you go to California or British Columbia, there are all sorts of color phases or color morphs of red-tailed hawks. You get dark ones, you get rusty colored ones, and so the field marks that we talk about here don't really apply. However, they all pretty much have that mark and that mark as well. Red-tailed hawks, of course, basically sit on wires or sit on telephone poles or sit on anything that's high, or they soar in circles in the sky. And they're big and they're kind of bulky. They've got big, wide wings that they can soar on, and relatively short tails compared to a rather sort of fat body. The other thing that is pretty diagnostic of red-tailed hawks in our part of the world anyway, is this patch of dark feathers going across the belly there. Occasionally they don't have that, or they have it minimally, but at least in Nova Scotia, they're always there to some extent. Here's another picture of one. It's lost a tail feather, probably due to molting. And again, that's got the same field marks. The amount of dark on the head is variable. This bird seems to have a dark eye, and that's another sign in red-tailed hawks of being an adult. And here's another one, again showing a rather variable amount of a generally darker head. The chest is darker. And something that might be important is that it's got an extra sort of band on the tip of the tail. And I'm going to come back to that too. Here's a juvenile red-tailed hawk. Kind of looks like a harrier almost, the way, or an owl, short-eared owl, right? With the round head and the eyes kind of looking at you, but it's not. It's a red-tailed hawk. Again, it's a rather pale one. It's got that black band there. It's got that mark there, and it's got that mark there. But you can tell it's not an adult. It's a juvenile bird because there's no red tail. It's got narrow bands right across the tail. But nevertheless, all the other field marks and the flight style, of course, this bird, it looked like it was going to bite my head off, or at least claw my head off, but it was just flying around and I happened to catch it in that particular pose. But that's a young red-tailed hawk. Here's another picture of a young red-tailed hawk. Again, it's rather pale. It's got a pale yellow eye. It's got, you can see, it's got the dark feathers in that area there, and it does not have a red tail because it's a young one. And here's an adult in sort of sunset light. Again, this is the back, and particularly older adults have these white markings on the wing feathers, on the upper side of the wings. So a lot of birds of prey have, but this is, again, a kind of a field mark for a red-tailed hawk. Almost looks like a V, the letter V is going to begin to form. Here's another young one, okay? Doesn't have a red tail, but it's got that banding pattern, and it's got yellow eyes. Now this one's kind of interesting. This is, again, a typical red-tailed hawk. It's an adult. You can just about see underneath the tail. It's got the reddish tail. This one has a lot of dark on the head. It's got a lot of sort of darkish feathers on the breast. The black band extends upwards and downwards so that it's much wider at the edge than it is across the middle. And it's got a dark stripe across the tail. Now, there are many subspecies or races, if you like, of red-tailed hawks across North America and into Central America and elsewhere as well. These markings that I've just described are characteristic of a race that tends to nest further north than Nova Scotia and supposed to be here on migration during the winter. Now, for those of you who use eBird, they separate red-tailed hawk races into the northern one, which is Buteo jamaicensis abieticola, to the local one, which is Buteo jamaicensis borealis. And they're both listed as rare, which I think is wrong because they're not rare at all. The borealis, boreal means northern, is actually a more southerly breeder than the abieticola. I'm not sure what that means. And neither of them are rare. The borealis is the expected breeding species in Nova Scotia, and the abieticola is at least a common visiting species during the winter. And just to illustrate, if you like, how confusing field marks can be, and also how contentious assigning a bird to a particular race or even a species can be. There's a website somewhere, I was trying to find it the other night, but I couldn't find it again. Anyway, I did see it, where the two leading experts probably on raptor identification in North America, Bill Clark and Jerry Liguori, both wrote extremely good, detailed descriptions of races of red-tailed hawks in northeastern North America, namely these two. One of them said, you can't differentiate between the two species. There's too much of an overlap. The other one said, yes, you can. It's easy to differentiate. They really are subspecies. And that's how it was left. So you can think what you like, but I personally think there is a significant overlap. I sent this particular picture to, what's the name of the guy? But anyway, he's a birder in Ontario who is very keen on the northern or Abieticola race of red-tailed hawk. And he said, yes, I'm going to put this on my website because it's absolutely classical Abieticola northern red-tailed hawk. So I guess if he said so, maybe it is. However, this also it's kind of like it because it's got this very wide swath of kind of dark feathers on the chest, although not all of the, it doesn't have a very dark head, and there's no stripe on the end of the tail. This was near a known nest in the middle of June. So if it's an Abieticola, it's breeding a long way south of where it should have been, across the road from my house. All right, that's enough of red tails. Let's look at another buteo. This is different. Most of the belly is black. It doesn't have those little comma-shaped marks, but it's got a great big black patch there, and it's got a rather pale head. And this is a winter visitor, a rough-legged hawk. They do breed further north than here. We used to see them in the summer in northern Newfoundland when I lived there when I first came to Canada. And they come in two color phases, or two color morphs, if you like. And one of them is nearly all black. If you see a nearly all black buteo in Nova Scotia in the winter, it's almost certainly going to be a rough-legged hawk. Because although just about every other buteo has a dark phase, most of them occur out west. And the only one that has more dark phase examples than light phase examples in the east is the rough-legged hawk. It's a winter visitor. It seems to have been declining in recent winters. I don't know why, but I'm seeing far less than I used to. Here's another example of a dark phase bird. I think it's a beautiful looking bird, basically black and white. And here's another dark phase bird. This was sitting on a post at Grand Pré. Even the dark face ones, they have a rather small head, and the head is usually kind of rather pale, and they have a little bit of an eye stripe. They're very light. Here's another one. This is a kind of intermediate. It's actually technically a light phase bird, but it's got all this yellowish brown color on it, but it still has these big black patches and the big black stripe across its belly. And they all have some dark at the end of the tail. Rough-legged hawks are, they're all feathers. They're lighter in weight than red-tailed hawks. So if you see a hawk in winter that is perched right on the very tip of a tree that's blowing in the breeze, and you think, how can that great big bird actually stay there and not weigh the tree down or whatever? It's probably a roughleg. Whereas red tails are too heavy to do that. The roughlegs can perch right out on the very edge, which red tails often can't. Roughlegs also hover. Red tails can look as if they're hovering, but what they're actually doing is so-called kiting, which is almost like hovering, but it's kind of into the wind and letting the wind blow across them and keep them in one place. Roughlegs can actually flap their wings and hover like an osprey can. This may be, in some places, the most numerically frequent buteo in the province, for reasons I'll explain in a minute. This is a broad-winged hawk. We rarely see them in the summer because they nest in deep woods, and I think they're actually quite rare anyway. I meant to look up the breeding bird atlas for Nova Scotia, but I forgot. But for an adult broad-winged hawk, the tail is pretty diagnostic. They have, they're called broad-winged because they have broad wings. They all have this dark trailing edge to the wing. And if you can count them, if the bird is soaring, they have 1, 2, 3, 4 long primary feathers, whereas a lot of other birds of prey have 5 long primary feathers. Now, the reason I say that these might be the most numerically numerous birds in the province is that huge flocks of them fly over some of the hawk watch places on migration. Mid to late September, you can see flocks of hundreds, if not 1,000 or more, flying over Briar Island when the wind is sort of east or northeast. And here's a small portion of one of these enormous flocks. They're called kettles. And, whoops, I'm going to go back. Yeah, I just like this picture because it showed 3 broad-winged hawks probably heading to the same place that this guy here is at the same time. So where are they going and why are they doing this? Here's Nova Scotia. Briar Island is here. Cape Sable Island is there. And the hawks appear to be flocking over these sort of ends of peninsulas, particularly Briar Island. I'm not sure where they go after that. The problem is that like all other buteos, they don't like, and other birds of prey in general, they don't like flying over water. But we don't see these big flocks, for example, here, where they could be flying around. They probably go high enough that they can see land down here and then fly down the coast. When they go further south, they follow this route here. And at this point, they're in between the ocean and a high mountain range. And there's a valley that goes between the two in Veracruz State in Mexico. Another place that the same thing happens is in Panama. Now, I was lucky enough in, I think it was the late 1990s, as far as I remember. I think it was 2002, actually, to go on a trip for a few days to Veracruz in Mexico. Unfortunately, you can't go now because of COVID, and I'm not sure I'd want to go to Veracruz State anyway, because it's one of the hotspots for drug cartels and so forth. But just look at these numbers. There was the roof of the Hotel Bienvenido, meaning welcome, in a seedy little town called Cartel. And people from Cornell and hawk watchers would spend all day standing on the roof with little clickers and go click, 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 click for every one of whatever species they saw. And I was there actually on the October the 16th of that, so 2 weeks ago today, on that in whichever year it was. And the previous day, they'd counted 383,069 turkey vultures, 285,407 Swainson's hawks. They'd had over 2 million broad-winged hawks for the season. So they're coming from all over North America. Swainson's hawks, of course, come mainly from the west. And they'd had a grand total. The day before I was there, they'd had 810,621 raptors. I mean, it's amazing. The phenomenon is called the River of Raptors. And indeed, that's what it looks like. You stand on the roof of this hotel and the sky is just full of raptors, mostly turkey vultures, but all this other stuff as well. Interestingly, there were various other projects going on, one of which they would go to the local market, they'd buy doves that were for sale, put them on the end of long strings and put them out into a field, and some of the hawks would dive down and catch the doves, and then they would be able to band the hawks. One of the ones they caught was a sharp-shinned, while I was there, watched this, was a sharp-shinned hawk that was banded in northern Ontario earlier that same year. So I think that's remarkable. A small bird like that can be banded down in Mexico. Anyway, if you ever get a chance to do that in the future, it's worth it. Okay, we're going back to broad-winged hawks. This is what you usually see, which is the juvenile or first year bird. Again, characteristic wing shape. It's got these splotches on the breast. And this time, the juvenile birds haven't got those very obvious tail bands. They've just got narrow tail bands. And this is what one adult looks like in the woods where it's nesting. They've got this orangey sort of breast and belly or underparts. This is an adult, it's got a darkish eye, and it's got these wide bands. So that's a broad. It's a small buteo. It's not as big as a red tail or a roughleg. And in fact, what I sometimes find is over Briar Island, like all other birds of prey, they flap and glide. And it's often difficult to decide whether a bird that's flapping and gliding and looks like that is a low-down Cooper's or sharp-shinned hawk or a high-up broad-winged hawk. So you need to kind of watch that. Here's an osprey. I think you probably all know what that looks like. It's our provincial bird. I can go into the why I disagree with that if you really want later, but anyway, that's our provincial bird. There's an osprey, long wings, they hover, they dive in and catch fish. They catch, they're not like gannets or kingfishers, they catch fish with their feet as against with their bill. They have that stripe there and there, as does this bird, which is a great black-backed gull. So again, if you see an osprey that's, you get a glimpse of it and it's sort of disappearing behind trees, and then it's windy and it's freezing cold and you don't really want to be out there, it's kind of not that hard to mix the two up. So let's look at small raptors that fly fast, and this is where what hits the road, so to speak. Right now, there are some Facebook groups such as Raptor ID and similar things, and by far the most common question asked is when somebody posts a picture, often of part of a bird, or it's fuzzy or it's out of focus, and they say, is this a sharp-shinned or a Cooper's hawk? Now, this bird here, both these were taken the same day in different lighting, you can see from the sky, on Briar Island at about this time of the year. They're accipiters, they're long and thin and they have long tails, there and there, okay? This bird, going from the sort of front end backwards, the head, it seems large and it sticks out. If you look carefully, it's got what they call a bit of a Roman nose. The leading edge of the wing is relatively straight without much of a kind of a wrist to it. And the markings on the breast are rather fine and look as if they've been painted on with a narrow pencil. We'll talk about the tail in a minute. This one, again, you can't really tell from this picture, but there is a bit of an angle between the forehead and the bill. It's got more of a kind of a wrist. In other words, the leading edge of the wing is jutting forward, and the head is not very far in front of the leading edge of the wing. And I think you can see that the markings on the breast are kind of splotchy. So this is a Cooper's hawk and this is a sharp-shinned hawk. Okay. Here's another picture of a sharp-shinned hawk. These are all juvenile birds, by the way. There's no sort of red on them, and they have a light yellow eye. And this again shows the classic features of a sharp-shinned hawk in flight. Very fast flapping and a few seconds of gliding, and then a flap, 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 and glide, and flap, 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 flap. And again, the head doesn't stick out much in front of these wrists. Here's an adult bird. I just think that's a beautiful picture. I was so pleased because it's got these glaring red eyes. It's just a super bird. Now, I took this a long, long time ago, and I've always assumed it's a sharp-shin, but I'm not so sure now. But the reason I assumed it was a sharp-shin was because it was taken a long time ago. Here's a juvenile sharp-shin, and you can see it's got a rounded head. The markings on the undersides are kind of a blotchy looking. And it was sitting on the top of my chickadee nest box and glaring at something. This picture I took outside my own property on the way home from work about 10 years ago. And it shows an accipiter, long tail with prominent bands underneath the tail. And it's got this kind of Roman-nosed appearance, bit of a blocky head kind of appearance as against a rounded head. And more importantly, the markings on the breast are very fine and look as if they're being drawn on with a fine pencil. Now, because this was a long time ago, I simply I didn't even think twice. And here's a lesson for everybody when I talked before about expect the unexpected, but don't worry too much if you don't see it. I posted this picture saying, oh, here's a nice picture of a sharp-shinned hawk. And somebody from Ontario said, oh, no, it's not. It's a Cooper's hawk. And this was actually the second photographed Cooper's hawk in the province. There was, I think, one photographed on Cape Sable Island before this one, and there were lots of site records before this. But since then, Cooper's hawks have become much more common, and I think sharp-shinned hawks are becoming much less common. I'm not sure about that latter statement, but certainly Coopers are becoming more common. I think it's a real phenomenon, and also people are learning to recognize them more. But it's not always possible to differentiate between the two. It can be really quite difficult, particularly with one photograph, and that's the problem. And going back to one of my first slides, that's where I said photographs can be confusing. There's no question this is a Cooper's hawk, as far as I'm concerned. Here's another one, which is also in my own backyard. It's not the same bird because this was about 5 years later. When they look at how square the head is, there's almost like a cap on the head. The nape or the back of the head is pale. It's got these very thin, sharp, demarcated breast marks. We'll talk about the tail in a minute. This bird was on a Christmas count at Miners Marsh in Kentville a few years ago. And I only got a back view of it, but again, it's got this kind of it's an adult bird. It's got a very dark eye. I looked away and it had gone, so I don't know what the front of it looked like as soon as I put my camera down. But again, this has got like a cap. It's got a kind of a Roman nose where the curve of the forehead goes straight down onto the upper mandible of the bill, and it's got a pale nape. So I have no doubt again that this is a Cooper's hawk. Again, before everybody started reporting them and they were common. Now I put this picture on. It's one of only two in this, no, one of three actually in this talk that is not my own. This was taken by a guy called Gary Howard in the US. And I put this on because of the tail. You can see here that the two outer tail feathers are shorter than the inner tail feathers. And you can imagine that this bird has got a tail that's half closed. If it opens the tail up, you can't always appreciate that. And if it closes the tail, because the outer tail feathers close first, you can't necessarily appreciate it either. And if you see this bird from the back, like the previous one, you can't tell that because the short outer tail feathers are hidden below these middle feathers when seen from behind. So when you see in field guides that Cooper's hawks have shorter outer tail feathers, or for example that they have a curved tail tip, you can only tell that from this particular angle when it's holding its tail feathers in that way. And so it's not a very good field mark. Here's a bird that I photographed from my own backyard not that long ago. This bird, again, it's got a kind of a Roman nose. It's got a bit of a pale nape. The coarse breast markings look more like a sharpshin than a Cooper's to me. It's a sort of, it may be an adult bird, I'm not sure because the eye is not pale yellow, but it's not orange either. And I think the outer tail feathers are shorter than the inner ones, but I'm not sure. This is the same bird, two different pictures. On this picture, it looks like it's got a bill that's kind of stuck on and doesn't have a Roman nose. The eye looks paler because the light's different. It still has that suggestion, at least, of a pale nape, and I can't tell anything about the tail. But here's, when it turned around, it's kind of got a blocky head. There's an angle here. It definitely got a pale nape, and it's got more of a Roman nose. So I'm not sure whether that is a Cooper's or a Sharpie, and I think it's a Cooper's. And there's nothing wrong, particularly with these two, in saying, I don't know. especially if you get a quick view or you've only got one picture which shows, for example, this angle as against that angle. As I say, I don't know. The sky was cloudy when I took this picture, so it looked white. The clouds parted a few minutes later, and the sky became blue. That probably alters the general appearance, and it probably alters the color of the bird as well. So in this particular case, I'm not sure. I'm sure I see Alex is here somewhere. He can probably tell me right away that it's one or the other. But I do know what this one is. I also took this one from my own backyard. If you see a flying Cooper's hawk sometimes, they look like a kind of a flying tube. They're long, and that's what this is. See the shape of the head? It's got that kind of, there's no angle between the head and the bill. It looks very fierce looking thing. It's got a very obvious white tip to the tail. There's no molting. Again, the field guides will talk about a white tip to the tail, but you often don't see that because the tail gets worn or damaged or whatever. And I'm not sure, yeah, I think you can see it on this picture. In fact, the tail is a little bit fanned out and the outer tail feathers are shorter. And here's the page from Sibley, which I don't find terribly helpful actually. But anyway, you can look through that if you want. Now let's look at some other small, how are we doing for time? Oh Lord. I've got a little bit longer to go. If anybody wants to leave, that's fine, but I'm going to continue for a bit. Other small birds that fly fast. Let's talk about merlins. A merlin is a falcon, and all falcons have big dark eyes. The first thing you want to do when you look at a small bird that's perched like that, if you can see the eye, is what color is it? If it's all black and it's big, it's a falcon. Diane, you're there now. Are you okay with me continuing?
Yes, I am. We did have a question about Coopers and Sharpshin. And it was,
okay, I can answer that now if you like.
the question was from Keith and Gladys Ketty, and they wanted to know if they hybridize, if Coopers and Sharpshin hybridize.
Well, I've wondered that myself. And I've also wondered why they were considered to be different species in the first place. And I have not been able to find out the answer.
Okay, we'll do some digging. Thanks.
Yeah. All right. We'll continue. I'll try and speed it up a bit. Here are a couple of pictures of merlins. One of the ways you can tell this one kind of looks like a peregrine almost. They're definitely smaller. Being falcons, they have big dark eyes. Some peregrines have a rather similar facial pattern to this, but the wings are way shorter than the length of the tail, and merlins, they're about the same length as a peregrine. Here's another picture of a merlin sitting up on a tree. Look at the size of the eye, and it's all dark. And it's got this kind of flat head, and there's really not much in the way of a so-called moustachial facial stripe. Here's another merlin. This is a young one. It's actually sitting on the roof of my son's new house in Wolfville. Much as merlins are really neat birds, you don't want to have one nest next door to you because they screech loudly all day and all night, all summer. All falcons basically catch birds, and merlins are very good at it. Merlins are small and kind of feisty and aggressive, and they'll chase larger birds of prey and larger anything almost, but they catch birds on the wings. Merlins have been if you like to say this, they've been a pest in terms of the chimney swift population in Wolfville. They also don't like people necessarily. Apart from screeching and so on, a few years ago, they had to close one of the public footpaths at Acadia University because merlins were attacking people walking along. So they're small and feisty, kind of like my Jack Russell dog. There are many different races and subspecies of merlins, which is very confusing. And the ones that we have in the east are basically this slightly darker one. There's an even darker one out west. There's a paler one in the prairies. There's a lot of mixture between the two. So traditional field marks like we would use for a warbler, for example, don't really apply to merlins. Another small bird that flies fast is the American kestrel. The adult male is pretty unmistakable. This is a female or young. like a lot of birds, the adult females, and this doesn't just apply to birds of prey, but it certainly does to most, adult females and young can look identical. Adult males often look different in some way. I think that kestrels are in big trouble in Nova Scotia. I used to see them when I first came here, 45 years ago, regularly all over the appropriate habitat. Now, the only place I ever see them, pretty much, is in migration on Briar Island, where there are usually one or two around the Lighthouse Road and the Western Light area in the fall. I only put this one in because I'm rather proud of it because it won first place in a recent contest. But I managed to catch this. This is on Briar Island. This is a kestrel. You see the two marks on the head. If you see that, it's diagnostic. And here's another picture of a kestrel. Now, just imagine that you see this shape, long tail, swept back wings, kind of jet fighter-like almost, and it's a dull, blustery, windy day, and you just see it for a second disappearing between two trees. How do you know it's not a pigeon or a swallow? And that's what I mean by you want to make sure the bird you're seeing is actually a bird of prey in the first place. Okay, bigger birds that fly fast. This is an adult northern goshawk. This is also an accipiter. It's basically the same shape as the smaller ones, the sharp-shin and the Coopers, but it's much more bulky. It's almost the size of a red-tailed hawk. They're extremely aggressive anywhere near the nest if you go near one in the summer. And you do see them, they're not very common, but you do see them from time to time in migration as well. The juveniles look a little bit different. This is an adult. It's kind of a different shape. It's a much more bulky bird, but if you're not sure what it is you're looking at, and it's the same with the juvenile here, the juvenile looks like a giant sharp-shin, about more bulky and about almost the size of a red tail. But if you look at the pattern of stripes on the tail, they're more kind of zigzaggy or wavy than the other accipiters, and that's pretty diagnostic as well. I guess we all know what this is. It's a peregrine falcon. That's not a big bird that flies fast. You used to be able to say, you can still sort of say where they come from, or there are different races of peregrines. It's one of the most widespread birds in the world, and it's coming back big time from when they were all in serious danger all over the world from pesticide poisoning in the 1940s and 50s. This bird has a very light-colored head and a narrow moustachial stripe. And that means it's probably a race that has the Latin name tundrius. It means it's a northerly breeding bird and it's migrating down the coast from northern Quebec or Labrador or somewhere like that. Here's another one that's probably a tundrius. Again, it has that relatively narrow moustachial stripe and a pale head. It's a juvenile bird in that it's the wings and kind of grayish as against bluish, and the streaking on the belly is vertical rather than sort of banded. This bird was on Briar Island 2 weeks ago. And here's an adult bird that I took a long time ago. It's eating a mallard. In the old days, they used to call peregrine falcons duckhawks. Now maybe we should, as I said at the beginning, call them peregrine parrots, but anyway. So this bird doesn't really have a pale head. It's got a fairly well-developed moustachial stripe, and it's kind of a bluish wings, probably an adult. And here's one that's definitely an adult. This was about 5 years ago. I was driving down a dirt road near the coast in Kings County. I had my moonroof open. A large bird and a medium-sized bird came zooming overhead. I didn't know what they were. I was driving, so I kind of pulled over, saw that the two birds had landed behind me, and I looked, and here it was a peregrine on a wood duck. And so I managed to sort of approach it close enough to take a picture. The peregrine actually let the wood duck go, so I guess I was interfering with nature. But anyway, I was kind of glad that the wood duck went. And then the peregrine obviously had a nest nearby because its mate showed up, and the two of them started screeching around near my head, and I dove back into the car and headed back off again. Anyway, this was unusual because this was a peregrine in what was basically woodland, although it was near the coast. Here's a more traditional picture. This one has basically a lot of dark on the head. It's got this very wide moustachial stripe, and there's much more horizontal banding on the flanks and extending towards the belly. So this is an adult bird. Now, apart from the tundrous northerly breeding birds, a lot of the peregrines in Nova Scotia are descendants of birds that were introduced a number of years ago to try and re-establish the population. And a lot of these were introduced from Alberta. And so you can't, apart from the tundrias, you can't really assign a race to most of the peregrines in Nova Scotia. This one, a good place to see a peregrine these days. Well, there's two good places that I know of. Of course, no bird is ever guaranteed, but one of them is at the Guzzle at Grand Pré in the fall, where they show up and chase shorebirds. And the other is where I took this picture, is near the old chicken plant on Fred Thomas Road, which is not far from Canning, where there's a flock of usually about 10,000 starlings, and the peregrines like to feed on them. And there's also a lot of gulls there. This one, again, is a sort of more typical one. It's an adult bird, almost certainly. It's got a relatively wide moustachial stripe, and not quite as wide as the last one. This bird was just great. We have a cottage in Avonport on the beach, and there's a peregrine's nest not very far, and the peregrines fly by the cottage on their way from the nest to where the shorebirds are at the Grand Pré Guzzle. So one day we had a bunch of birders for the day, for a meal, and we were all sitting out on the deck. Some of the people there I see were actually here that afternoon, and this peregrine just flew very nicely and not too quickly past everybody to claps and cheers and photographs. So here's a rather old picture illustrating some of the races of peregrines that can be seen. So I'm going to just finish off with a few quick slides called You Should Be So Lucky and Lookalikes. So here's a sort of lookalike. This is another big dark bird that soars and flies. But when you compare it to a juvenile or young or 1 or 2 year old bald eagle, it's got a smaller head. It doesn't have this enormous beak. There's no white in the wing pits, but the white is further out there and there. And it's got a characteristic narrow band of white there. And this is a juvenile golden eagle. Very rare in Nova Scotia, but they do show up from time to time. This one was flying over Briar Island one Sunday morning about 3 or 4 years ago. Interestingly, we have bald eagles flying around all over the place and all the time in Kings County, and a lot of the local birders kind of ignore them. We shouldn't. People would from time to time report golden eagles in Kings County in June and July, and I would probably wrongly or rather arrogantly dismiss them all as saying, right, obviously a young bald eagle. But somebody, I don't think he's on tonight, but somebody who is an extremely good and expert birder, very carefully identified and described an adult golden eagle flying with juvenile bald eagles over Canning a couple of years ago in the early part of the summer, I think it was. So good example of be on the lookout for something that's unusual, but make sure you can identify it before you kind of report it or whatever. And here's, again, the page in Sibley explaining the difference between golden and bald eagles. Here's another picture. This is the one you just saw, and this is a juvenile bald eagle, also one you saw earlier on, for comparison. I did not take this picture. I have never seen an adult golden eagle in Nova Scotia, but this is what an adult looks like with this so-called golden nape. If you see that, then you know what you've got. And incidentally, bald eagles and golden eagles are not closely related. They're two completely different families. Golden eagles are part of the so-called Aquila family, and bald eagles are part of the sea eagle family, which their only sort of biological similarity is they're both big and dark. This is, you can tell what this is because it's got a big black eye and it's got a long tail and pointed wings, and so it's a falcon. But you can't tell the size from this picture. It's an old picture, you can see there, this was an old slide, and it's a gyrfalcon, spelled G-Y-R. This is a very prized bird to be seen in Nova Scotia because they're rare, big, and spectacular, like golden eagles for that matter. And they come in all kinds of color phases. This is a so-called gray morph, which is kind of grayish, and you can see the pale underparts. This is a dark morph. It was a number of years ago. There'd been an adult male northern harrier hanging around the dikes at Crown Prey. I went down on a very windy morning at about this time of the year to try and get a picture of it. Never saw it, but then I suddenly saw this thing kind of hanging in the wind, and I thought, oh my God, that's a dark-phased gyrfalcon, I think. Yes, it is. I managed to get these good pictures. And here's one of the pictures. This is the dark phase. And is Phil Taylor looking at this evening? Because the other day, Phil put a very distant picture, which is very grainy and fuzzy, of what he thought was probably a gyrfalcon on Facebook and wanted comments. And my comment was that the silhouette that he got of this very distant bird looks just like this, with very broad wing bases. And I think Dominic Cormier commented on that too. Anyway, it's a falcon. It doesn't really look like a falcon in some ways because the wings are not that pointed, but they can fly very fast. They don't stoop vertically like a peregrine, but they fly very fast and kind of fly down their prey. I know somebody who actually saw one of these catch a pheasant in flight, which must have been quite the sight. The well-known color phase of gyrfalcons is the light phase, where they're almost entirely white. I've seen that in Iceland, but I've never seen that in Nova Scotia. There was one, I believe, in the Halifax area. It was a one-day wonder about 3 years ago. Mm-hmm. And here is a comparison of that bird with a juvenile goshawk. They're about the same size. They look in many ways pretty similar, but they're not. If you really get a good look, if you can manage to see the eye, look at the difference in color. Goshawk has a yellow eye, gyrfalcon has a dark eye. We're talking about white birds. This is the other picture I did not take. It's a white-faced gyrfalcon, but it's got a lot of dark on it. It doesn't really look like a falcon, does it, in terms of shape, but that's what it is. The other white bird you might see is a snowy owl. This one was at Grand Pré a few years ago. But if you see an all-white bird, and it's a bird of prey in Nova Scotia, probably the most frequent is an albino or albinistic red-tailed hawk. There have been 3 or 4 in the province since I've been living here. They've stuck around in one area the whole winter pretty much. This particular one here was around what is now the marijuana plant near the 101 between Wolfville and Windsor. And it stayed all winter. And there was another one like that as well. Their rear are all white with no dark markings on them like that or that. And they have the shape and the flight characteristics of a red-tailed hawk. So beware of that possibility. This is something I did see once. Actually I've seen twice now in Nova Scotia. This is a Mississippi kite. This was the first one seen in Nova Scotia. It was a life bird for me, and it was over my own property on Briar Island, so it was kind of a triple whammy. A peculiar shape with odd-shaped wings and very white underneath as well. This is a bird that shows up just about every year somewhere. It's a small buteo. It's got this very characteristic tail, mostly black with narrow white stripes, and it's got a lot of white around the feathers, otherwise it's dark. and it's got a little bit of kind of orange on the shoulders. So it's a red, whoops, that one. There we go. No, there we go. It's a red-shouldered hawk. They're pretty common further south, and if you go to Florida in the winter, or actually Florida any time of the year, they are by far the most common buteo to be seen in Florida. The race that occurs in Florida is a little bit paler than this one, but they're more, but they do occur just about every year. They're quite small. They're the same size as a broad-winged hawk, and in flight, they look very like a broad-winged hawk as well. So again, if you're in the vicinity of a place where there are a lot of broad-winged hawks, like Briar Island in mid-September, it's worth just looking at every one if you can to see if you can identify a red-shouldered hawk in with them. This one overwintered and actually was being fed with scraps at a nursery, a plant nursery in Falmouth. So this bird, three of us, and certainly the other two were expert birders, came around the corner on Briar Island one winter's day a few years ago, and this bird was sitting in a tree right by my camp. And we had quite an argument as to what it was. Well, you know, it's kind of got this pale head, and it's sitting on top of a tree, and it's a rough leg, but the undersides don't look right for a rough leg, and I'm not sure what it is. And then it flew off, and it's got these great long wings where the front of the wing is paler than the back of the wing. And it's also got all these splotches, which make it into a juvenile Swainson's hawk, which actually should be somewhere between Alberta and Mexico at that time of the year. There have been a few in Nova Scotia, well documented and photographed. That was rather a nice bird to see. This was rather a nice bird to see. Again, of course, I didn't take this picture, but this was the famous, to many of you, Eurasian kestrel that showed up in Hartland Point. It was probably there for some time before anybody actually recognized it as not being a merlin or a North American kestrel. And it stayed around, much to the delight of many birders from all over North America, for most of the winter until it was thought to have been either killed or eaten by a rough-legged hawk. So this, some of you have heard the quick story I will tell, but Rick Whitman and I were down at my cabin on Briar Island on the 1st of June, about 7 or 8 years ago. There was something wrong with the toilet in my cabin, and I was basically up to my elbows in you-know-what, trying to fix it. Suddenly there was a shout from outside saying, "Richard, get your camera right now." I said, "Why? I can't." He said, "Well, you just have to. There's a bird I can't identify. I don't know what it is." So I rushed out with poop all over my camera and me. And this bird was circled once overhead and then disappeared again. It had the appearance of everything looked like a turkey vulture. It was big. It had that V-shaped dihedral, but it had this stripy tail, which makes it a zone-tailed hawk, which should be in Mexico or further south, or at the very least in southern Arizona. And I don't know why it was there, but roughly the same time, or a few weeks later, another one was seen in Massachusetts, and it was a different bird. They could tell by the exact details of the plumage. There is a probable previous record for Nova Scotia back in the I forget, Eric would know. But people who've looked at the pictures of that, some of them don't think it's a zone-tailed, so I don't know. Anyway, this was just completely off the wall and very lucky. I've never seen one of these in Nova Scotia. Other people have. It's a swallow-tailed kite. It's one of the most beautiful of all raptors. Diane, you will remember we saw lots of them in Costa Rica, and that was just a great sighting for me, I thought, anyway. Yeah. Actually, come to think of it, this is my photo, but it's in Florida. It's not in Nova Scotia. And they're migratory as well, but they don't usually get this far up. There have been a few sightings in Nova Scotia, one of which was apparently mistaken for a magnificent frigate bird initially, because that's another bird that has this great, huge forked tail. There have been regular sightings of black vultures in Nova Scotia. They're extremely common further south. The further south you go in the US, Central America and northern part of South America, they're all over the place. They're much more common, in fact, than turkey vultures in many places. Certainly in Costa Rica in February, we saw lots and lots of them. They kind of almost look like chickens in some way, I think. This one, they're the same bird. And they were hanging around a dump in Cape Breton. And I think it's been there for a number of years, every winter. I don't know where it goes in the summer. But again, they don't fly like turkey vultures. They're smaller. They only have white at the very wingtips. The rest of the wings are dark. They have this head and neck, which is bare and gray as against red. And they fly differently. They don't have that shallow V like a turkey vulture. This is another bird that shouldn't have been anywhere near Nova Scotia. This is a northern or crested caracara, which is actually related to falcons. It's a kind of falcon. It's the national bird of Mexico, of all things. They're relatively common in Florida, Texas, and the further south you go into Mexico and so on. The first one of these in Nova Scotia was seen near the remains of a carcass, I think, by Lawrencetown Beach. Lots of people saw it. I went 3 times and never did see it. Then a second one showed up in Canso, and there was a third one down in Yarmouth County, and this was a fourth one that showed up in the valley, and I did manage finally to see this. Ian McLaren, the late Ian McLaren, who hopefully many of you knew, was able to analyze photographs of the birds flying and analyze the wingtips, and came to the conclusion that there were actually 4 different birds in Nova Scotia over a 4-year period, when there were probably none anywhere north of Florida. So you never know what you might see if you look out for raptors. Okay, some reading material if you want to pursue this further. A good field guide, and as I said before, my 2 favorites are Sibley and National Geographic. There are other books. There's a book, this may not work, I don't know. I'm going to hold this up. Is it a mirror image or not? It is. Okay, well, that's called Hawks in Flight, and it's by Pete Dunn and Sibley and Clay Sutton, who were the hawk counters at one time at Cape May. And it's excellent because it's full of descriptions and photographs of hawks in flight, and it explains all about the jizz and the flight style and so on and so forth. There's a book called Sibley's Birding Basics, which I really like, which I'll hold up the mirror image if you want to see that. It talks about the process of identifying birds. It's not a field guide, but it talks about what you should look for in any bird, what not to look for, what the pitfalls are, and so on and so forth. And of course, if you look online, there's all kinds of stuff. You can Google hawk identification. The Macaulay Library is an enormous resource. If you're serious about birding, you should be putting your sightings into eBird. And eBird is linked to the Macaulay Library, which is also run by Cornell University. And they have if you're a photographer, every photo that you put on eBird ends up in the Macaulay Library. So you can look at hundreds of photographs of, let's say, sharpshins and Cooper's hawks and compare them. There's a blog from an organization called Hawkwatch International, which often has pictures and descriptions. There's a Facebook page on Hawk ID. There's a thing called Birds of North America Online, which is not an identification. It's actually now been expanded. It's now Birds of the World Online. And they take every species of bird in the world and they describe it and they talk about it and they talk about the biology and the ornithology of it. And there are lots of pictures and there are links to the Macaulay Library. There's a phone app, which is really nice, which is put out by, I think it's put out by Hawkwatch International. And it's got pictures and videos of raptors in flight, which you can look at on your phone and compare, say, Sharpie flying to a Cooper's flying, or a Merlin to a Peregrine flying, and so on and so forth. So there's lots of stuff out there. And there it goes, the last raptor of my talk. So thank you for listening. And if anybody has any questions, and if Diane wants to continue this, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Richard. I'm waiting for my first zone tail. Actually, I'd like to see a gyrfalcon first, but you know, I'll take a swallowtail or anyway. I don't have any questions, but I just wondered if anybody else had questions. If you do, just raise your hand or type in the chat or take yourself off mute, and we'll go from there.
I'm trying to find.
Okay, you're off. Someone, Keith, you are off mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it was great to see you again, Richard, and it was really enjoyable. A lot better than sitting in front of the TV all evening.
Well, thank you. Anything else? Alex, are you still there? So, any comments on what I said? Or anybody else? No.
Alex is, I think he's just unmuting. Alex maybe doesn't have audio. I'm not seeing any audio on it with him.
Could be. Okay.
Oh,
I need a bit of help. All I've got is a list of people on the right-hand side, but I don't have anything in my main screen here.
okay. I will let you know when there's questions coming up, but Alex did say that he does not have a mic,
Okay.
and he can't find any record of hybrids between Coopers and Sharpie.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah. And why, Richard, I was interested in why you wondered why they were different species. You really think that they're that much alike?
Well, they're pretty. I mean, it's like a lot of these things. I remember when Bridget Stutchbury, came and gave a talk in Halifax a number of years ago about some of her research on birds. And one of the things she talked about was how birds recognize each other. And birds apparently, for example, can see very clearly in ultraviolet light, which we can't. And I asked her a question which she could never really answer at the time very satisfactorily. And that is this. How can a herring gull, for example, not interbreed with, let's say, a glaucous winged gull, which to us looks almost identical, and yet they're considered to be different species? Actually, they do interbreed occasionally. And I think it's the same with Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks. Presumably, they have some sense or something in their brain that tells them that they're different species that we don't really recognize apart from these very subtle field marks. I find it hard to believe that a bird that spends a lot of its time whizzing about through the trees can see enough of another bird's field, the subtleties of the tail or the head shape or whatever, that it wouldn't necessarily interbreed with it or hybridize with it or recognize it as a different species. But I don't know. Anyway, I don't have an explanation. There's something that these birds have in their biology or their psychology or their brain or all three, which is able to distinguish one species from what to us looks like an almost identical species.
Yeah. I mean, they're different, definitely are different sizes.
Well, yes and no. As I said before, a female Sharpie is almost the same size as a male Cooper's. There's almost no overlap, but there's only like a half a centimeter or 1 centimeter difference in the length.
Yeah.
Or wingspan. I'm still looking to see how I can get something other than a list on the left-hand side of my
So you're looking for, are you trying to see
Well,
different?
I'm looking for the main Zoom page, actually.
Oh, okay, right. You have to stop sharing, and to do that, just go down to the bottom.
Oh, wait a minute. No, I've got, wait a minute, there's mute. All I've got is something at the top.
Okay.
Stop video participants,
If you
new
put your
share.
cursor down by the bottom, you might find that you get more options.
Well, there's a Zoom thing there. No, that didn't do anything. Let's bring your shared window to the front. Maybe I can do that. Nope. New share. No.
I'm gonna change it so only the host can share, and that should shut you off. See if that works. How's
Okay,
that?
that works for me.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that's good now. Yeah, I've got a big picture of you and little pictures of other people. That's what
My condolences. You could try the gallery view rather than the speaker view.
All right. Yeah, I'll do that. Gallery. There we are. Yep. Okay.
So
Any comments?
we don't have any question. Well, we do have one question from Gary Myatt,
Okay.
which is, we hear of red tail and red shouldered hybridizing. Are there any other hybridizations that you know of?
There probably are, but I can't off the top of my head think of what they are. There is, I don't think they're very common. I mean, I know there's this hybrid red-shouldered and red-tailed that's been hanging around. Is it down near Yarmouth somewhere? In Digby County, isn't it? For a few years now. But I don't think they can be frequent. I mean, a lot of birds that look, apart from gulls, which seem to hybridize fairly freely, most birds don't actually hybridize. Well, there are some warblers that do, okay, golden-winged and blue-winged, although they may actually genetically be color variants of the same species. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Alex may know, and he may type in too if he knows more about.
Yeah. Okay. Not to worry. Anyway.
And Ruben just offered. Ruben Fried says anyone interested in bird calls should also know about Zeno Canto project, which is a fantastic curated collection of information, and he provided the link to that in the comments.
That's a great resource. Now for raptors, basically peregrines, merlins, and goshawks all sound the same near the nest to me. Anyway, I've never heard a Cooper's hawk or a sharpie near the nest, but I wouldn't be surprised if they sounded similar. Bald eagles have the most un-raptor-like squeak, basically. Red tails are the ones that appear in all movies and TV shows when anything that's fierce, whether it's a dinosaur or a dragon or a raptor, is shown, particularly if it's in cartoon form, and the accompanying sound is usually a red-tailed hawk.
Right, yeah. Okay, that's all the questions that we have, Richard. Thank you very much again.
Well, that's it for me.
Lots of great comments in the chat section. So lots of thanks from everyone.
Okay, well, thank you for listening.
Thank you. See you, folks.
Yeah.
Happy birding. Still migration season.
There were this morning there were snow buntings at Grand Pré. There were eagles all over the place there. There was one shorebird left, which was a semi-palmated sandpiper. I tried to make it to a western, but I couldn't.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.